The wedding ballroom looked like something out of a movie. Golden chandeliers sparkled across the ceiling while soft piano music drifted through the crowded hall. Waiters moved between tables carrying expensive drinks, and laughter echoed from every corner of the room. My sister had always dreamed of a perfect wedding, and tonight she finally had it. Hundreds of guests filled the massive venue dressed in designer suits and elegant gowns. Friends, relatives, business partners, and people my father wanted to impress all sat beneath glowing lights and towering flower arrangements. And then there was me. I sat quietly near the back corner of the room, away from the main family table. My suit was clean but old, and I could feel the judgment every time someone glanced in my direction. Most of the guests knew my father as a wealthy businessman with influence and connections across the city. To them, he was successful, respected, powerful. But to me, he was the man who spent most of my life reminding me I would never be good enough. I should have known tonight would be no different. My sister caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small smile. It was nervous, almost apologetic. She knew how things were between Dad and me, but tonight wasn't supposed to be about family drama. I tried to smile back anyway. For her sake, I promised myself I'd stay quiet no matter what happened. Then my father stood up. The entire ballroom immediately shifted its attention toward him. He adjusted his expensive black tuxedo, took the microphone from the wedding host, and tapped it twice with a confident grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising his glass. "Thank you all for being here on this beautiful night." The crowd applauded warmly. Dad smiled proudly at my sister and her new husband standing beside him. Tonight is about celebrating success, family, and the future. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. He slowly scanned the room while guests listened carefully to every word. My father loved attention. He loved being admired even more. "You know," he continued with a small laugh, "raising children teaches you an important lesson." A few people chuckled politely. "Some children make you proud from the very beginning. They work hard, make smart choices, and become something valuable." My sister's smile faded slightly. Then Dad's eyes landed directly on me. "And then," he said, pausing long enough for the silence to grow heavier, "some children choose to throw their lives away chasing meaningless dreams." The room became uncomfortably quiet. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me instantly. Dad shook his head dramatically before taking a sip from his glass. "I spent years trying to help my son become successful. Years trying to guide him toward a real future. But some people are simply determined to disappoint you." A few nervous laughs spread across the ballroom. My chest tightened, but I stayed silent. I could already feel my sister panicking beside him. She whispered something under her breath, probably begging him to stop, but Dad ignored her completely. "As far as I'm concerned," he continued coldly, "I only have one child worth celebrating tonight." My mother stared down at her plate without saying a word. I felt humiliation crawl through every inch of my body as guests exchanged awkward looks around the room. Some avoided eye contact with me entirely. Others stared openly like they were watching a public execution. Then my father pointed directly toward the ballroom doors. "If you had any respect left," he said firmly, "you'd leave right now." The entire ballroom froze after my father's words. For a moment, nobody moved. The soft music had already stopped, and even the waiters stood motionless. Near the walls holding silver trays in trembling hands. I could feel hundreds of eyes locked onto me, waiting to see what I would do next. My throat tightened so badly I could barely breathe. My sister looked devastated. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Dad, please." But he ignored her completely. His face remained cold and emotionless, like humiliating me in front of everyone was perfectly normal. Maybe for him, it was. He had spent years treating me like a failure, but tonight felt different. Tonight he wanted an audience. I slowly pushed my chair back, the sound scraping across the marble floor louder than it should have been. A few guests looked uncomfortable, but nobody said a word. Not one person stood up for me. I grabbed the back of my chair for balance and forced myself not to react. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break apart in front of the entire room. Then the ballroom doors exploded open. The loud impact echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Every head snapped toward the entrance instantly. 5 Marines in full dress blues stepped inside in perfect formation, their polished black shoes striking the floor with synchronized precision. The bright lights reflected off rows of medals pinned across their uniforms, and their presence alone changed the atmosphere of the room in seconds. Conversations disappeared completely. The guests stared in stunned silence as the Marines walked forward with calm, disciplined expressions. Even people who had no military background could feel the weight of authority surrounding them. My father blinked in confusion. The lead Marine was taller than the others, his posture straight as steel. Silver hair lined the edges of his sharply pressed cap, and his chest carried enough ribbons and decorations to command respect from anyone who saw them. The moment I recognized him, my heart nearly stopped. Colonel Reyes. I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. Whispers spread across the ballroom. Why are Marines here? Who are they looking for? Is something wrong? My father tried to recover his composure, forcing a tight smile as the group approached the center of the hall. Gentlemen, he said cautiously, this is a private wedding. Colonel Reyes never even looked at him. Instead, his eyes found me standing near the back table. And then something happened nobody in that ballroom expected. The colonel stopped walking, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand sharply to his forehead in a formal salute. The 4 Marines beside him immediately did the same. The room fell into absolute silence. I stood frozen in shock as one of the most respected officers I had ever served under saluted me in front of hundreds of people. Staff Sergeant Walker, Colonel Reyes said clearly, his voice carrying across the ballroom, it's an honor to see you again. My father's confident expression vanished. The guests looked between us in complete confusion. I lowered my eyes for a second, still stunned. Sir. The colonel finally turned toward my father. His face remained calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness in his voice now. We overheard what was said to your son tonight. Dad straightened awkwardly. You don't understand the situation. No, Colonel Reyes replied evenly. I understand it perfectly. The colonel stepped closer, his medals glinting beneath the chandeliers while the ballroom remained dead silent around him. What I don't understand, he continued, is how a father could stand in front of this many people and insult a man who spent years risking his life for others. A wave of whispers swept across the ballroom the moment Colonel Reyes finished speaking. Guests who had been smirking at me minutes earlier now looked confused. Almost nervous. Some turned toward my father waiting for him to explain himself, while others stared at the Marines standing proudly beside me. The atmosphere had completely changed. What had started as a glamorous wedding now felt tense enough to crack apart at any second. My father forced out a laugh, but it sounded hollow. You military people don't know the full story, he said, loosening his collar slightly. My son has always been reckless. He walked away from real opportunities. He embarrassed this family for years. The colonel's expression never changed. Is that so? Dad nodded quickly, trying to regain control of the room. He was never responsible, never successful. I gave him every chance to become something respectable. I could see sweat beginning to form along his forehead now. Then one of the younger Marines stepped forward carrying a polished wooden case in both hands. Inside the glass was a perfectly folded American flag. The entire ballroom watched silently. The Marine stopped beside Colonel Reyes and carefully held the case toward the guests. You mean the same man, he said firmly, who carried 3 wounded Marines across 200 yards of open fire. The room went silent again. My father's face tightened instantly. Another Marine reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Without hesitation, he turned the screen toward several nearby guests. Photos appeared one after another. Me in combat gear beside military vehicles. Me helping injured soldiers onto evacuation helicopters. Me standing covered in dust and blood beside a damaged building overseas. Gasps spread across the ballroom as people leaned closer to look. That operation saved 7 lives, the Marine continued. Including mine. I immediately shook my head slightly, hoping they would stop. I never wanted attention for any of it. The last thing I expected tonight was for my military service to become public in front of my entire family. But Colonel Reyes wasn't finished. Your son never once asked for recognition, he said while staring directly at my father. In fact, he tried to keep most of this hidden. My sister covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face now. What is he talking about? One of my uncles whispered. The colonel slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded document. This, he said calmly, is the commendation for Staff Sergeant Walker receiving the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism. Several guests gasped loudly. My father looked completely stunned. The colonel opened the paper carefully. During an enemy ambush, he read, Staff Sergeant Walker repeatedly exposed himself to hostile fire in order to rescue wounded Marines trapped behind a destroyed convoy vehicle. Nobody in the ballroom moved. Despite sustaining injuries himself, the colonel continued, he refused evacuation until every member of his unit was safely extracted. The silence felt suffocating now. A woman near the front table whispered, "Oh my God. I could barely look up anymore." The same people who had watched me get humiliated minutes earlier were now staring at me like they were seeing an entirely different person. My father swallowed hard before trying to speak again. He never told us any of this. Colonel Reyes folded the document slowly. Because real heroes usually don't, he replied. One of the Marines looked directly at my father, his jaw tight with anger. While you were calling him a disappointment tonight, he said quietly, some of us are alive because of him. My mother finally looked up from her plate for the first time all evening. Her eyes filled with tears the moment they met mine. And for the first time in my entire life, my father looked small. The ballroom remained frozen in silence after the Marine's words. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. The same guests who had watched my father humiliate me now stared at him with expressions of disbelief and discomfort. Some looked embarrassed for ever joining in. Others couldn't even look at him at all. My father stood near the center of the dance floor gripping his wine glass so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The confidence he carried earlier had completely disappeared. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. Small. Colonel Reyes stepped forward calmly and bent down to pick up the microphone my father had dropped earlier. The sharp squeal of feedback echoed through the ballroom before fading into silence again. Every eye followed him. He looked around the room slowly, his posture straight and composed beneath the glowing chandeliers. I've spent over 30 years serving beside Marines, he began, his deep voice carrying across the entire hall. And during that time, I've learned something important about character. Nobody moved. A man's value is not measured by his salary, his status, or how well he impresses a crowd. Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. It's measured by what he does when other people's lives depend on him. The colonel turned slightly toward me. Your son understood that better than most men twice his age. My father opened his mouth like he wanted to respond, but no words came out. The colonel continued speaking calmly. While many people spend their lives chasing recognition, Staff Sergeant Walker risked everything expecting none. The Marines standing beside him nodded quietly. He carried wounded men through gunfire, the colonel said. He volunteered for missions others were terrified to take. And after all of it, he returned home without demanding praise from anyone. The room felt impossibly still. Then Colonel Reyes slowly walked toward me. I could feel my chest tightening again as he stopped directly beside me and placed one firm hand on my shoulder. This man, he said proudly, represents the kind of courage most people only talk about. My sister burst into tears completely now. Her husband wrapped an arm around her while staring at me in shock. Across the ballroom, I noticed several guests beginning to clap quietly. At first it was only a few people. Then more joined in. The applause slowly spread from table to table until the entire room filled with thunderous clapping. People stood from their chairs one after another. A standing ovation. The sound echoed through the ballroom walls so loudly it almost didn't feel real. I stood there completely stunned while hundreds of people applauded me. The same room that had watched me get disowned minutes earlier was now on its feet. My father looked around helplessly as guests ignored him entirely. Several of his business associates shook their heads in disappointment before turning away from him. One couple quietly left their table without saying a word. For years, my father controlled every room he entered. Tonight he had lost the room completely. Then something happened I never expected. My mother slowly stood up. Tears streamed down her face as she walked across the ballroom toward me. Her hands trembled slightly before she reached out and touched my face like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. I'm sorry, she whispered brokenly. Emotion hit me so hard I couldn't speak. Behind her, the applause continued growing louder. Colonel Reyes finally lowered the microphone and looked toward my father one last time. A real family, he said quietly, doesn't abandon the people who would sacrifice everything for them. My father stood completely alone in the center of the ballroom while the people around him slowly turned their backs on him one by one.